started. I'm sorry that we're a little bit behind. Thank you for being with us today. And I want to mention to anyone from the public who's visiting with us today, something we forget to mention sometimes, that if you parked in the library parking, then our staff can give you a parking validation. So just, if that is the case, raise your hand. Staff can, these fine people over here can get you a parking validation. So, to begin our very first meeting of the year, item 1 is our nomination of council chair and vice chair for calendar year 2019.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Councilmember
I would like
Fowler.
to make a nomination for chair, and I'd like to nominate Mr. Charlie Luke.
Mr. Charlie Luke, do you accept this nomination?
Madam Chair, I do accept that nomination.
Do you want to make a speech or just leave it at that?
We can, you know me, I'm always happy to make a speech, but we can leave it.
I feel a speech coming on after a vote.
We can leave it at that right now.
Are there any other nominations? Do I need to formally close nominations to let us vote? Then we've got a ballot here that we will pass out as we always do. Council members, put your name on it. Mark your, do we do vice chair selection at the same time?
No.
Separately?
We'll do that separately.
Okay, so please make your selection, then I will need to read those out loud, and we will see if Councilmember Luke's nomination for chair.
And I have to confess that we've inadvertently listed former Councilmember Derek Kitchen on the ballot. So please disregard.
That is so you. Charlie may still have the votes, even if you vote for Councilmember Kitchen. Oops, sorry. There we go. When you are done, just pass them back this way. It's very secretive with your name on it. Like Andrew's doing a write-in. Chris votes for Charlie Luke. James votes for Charlie Luke. Charlie votes for Charlie Luke. Amy voted for Charlie Luke. I also voted for Charlie Luke. And Andrew Derek Kitchen Johnston voted for Charlie Luke. Councilmember Luke, congratulations.
Thank you very much. And Madam Chair, thank you for all the work that you have done this last year. Chris, thank you as well for your great work as vice chair. You know, I think what I plan on doing this year is not a whole lot different from the direction that things have been going. I think that we are moving in a good direction as a city. You know, while we usually will have a working retreat to talk about issues, we're going to do that later this year than usual, because I do want to wait until the District 4 seat is filled before we do that. But the recommendation that I'm going to be making is that we don't change the council priorities, that we continue moving forward with those key priorities. If there are issues that we do want to bring up as a council, we can do that. But you know, when we look at infrastructure, when we look at housing, those issues are going to continue, and so I don't think that there's you know, a great necessity to change that direction at this point. You know, as always, as a council, we need to be nimble. We need to be able to take on key issues as they arise. This will continue as always. So. Thank you all. I look forward to working with you and continuing moving things forward.
Thank you, Charlie.
Madam Chair, I'd like to make a motion. I'd like to nominate Councilmember James Rogers as Vice Chair.
Mr. Rogers,
Yes.
do you accept that nomination?
Accept. Yes.
Any other nominations for Vice Chair? Then let's vote.
This gives you yet another opportunity to vote for former Councilmember Derek Kitchen.
That ship has sailed. All right. James Rogers voted for James Rogers. Charlie voted for James Rogers. Amy voted for James Rogers. Andrew voted first for James Rogers and second for Derek Kitchen. Chris voted for James Rogers, and I voted for James Rogers. Congratulations, and thank you for your willingness to serve us again, both of you. Logistically, I'm going to chair the rest of this meeting and today, and then next week we'll make the switch, I think, if I'm not.
It becomes official across the hall after you've confirmed the vote.
Okay, great.
And then we'll have a hat for you to draw out of so that you can choose which chairs you sit in.
Tomorrow, or
The
next
first
week?
Of the next meeting.
Okay. So we'll just stay the course for the rest of today. And I just want to thank you all for the teamwork that goes into the work we do and the teamwork that went into the last year. It was my incredible honor to be the chair. So we're on to item A2, asset naming proposal for Ty's Garden in Hidden Hollow Natural Area. Brian Fulmer of our council staff is here to brief us on that, and I know Lewis Kogan is in the audience. Thank you for coming up, Lewis, from Trails and Natural Lands. He is our division director. Brian, would you start us off, please?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. We're going to be briefing you on a proposal from Utah Natural Lands,
Utah Open Lands.
Utah Open Lands, rather, on naming a small section of Hidden Hollow, which is in District 7 in the Sugar House Business District, after Ty Harrison, an emeritus professor from Westminster College, who was very instrumental in developing a riparian area in the yellow shaded section of the image up there. The red border is Hidden Hollow. This is considered a major asset, even though it's a very small piece of land. Any land that the city owns for naming purposes is considered a major asset. The code, city code, states that the administration gives the city council 15 business days to respond to a proposal, and if the council does not respond within that time, then the administration can go ahead with the naming process. The code also says that the city council is responsible for all major asset naming, so there's a little bit of a disconnect there. One of the questions that we're hoping to get answered is whether the council would like to, first of all, proceed using its legislative authority through a resolution to name this piece of land potentially, and second of all, if the council is interested in having the the attorney's office rather draft some clarifying language to that section of code just to clean it up and make it so more clear. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lewis.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, Council, Madam Chair. I don't have a very long presentation for you on this item, but I don't know if any of you had the pleasure of knowing the late Dr. Ty Harrison, but he really was he was an incredible person, and in my short time at the city, he was a tremendous proponent of natural lands, especially natural lands in Salt Lake City, and not only he was involved in the Hidden Hollow natural area from the very get-go with kids organized for the protection of the environment in the early 90s or mid-90s, and he performed the initial ecological assessment of Hidden Hollow in the late 90s, was involved in the master plan, and then over the next 20 years remained very involved there with all of the volunteers and community members who continue to support that small but important natural area with their time and effort. And Ty was he provided he was a constant source of information and advice to the Trails and Natural Land, well, it was then the Open Space Program. And virtually every natural area that we have engaged in any kind of a restoration effort around the city, Ty provided invaluable information to us. Utah Open Lands came to us about this time last year with the proposal to name this area after Dr. Ty Harrison. They felt like this would be a very appropriate location. It was basically the last location in Salt Lake City or in the Salt Lake Valley where he was really putting a lot of his time and effort and energy working on a small native forest restoration project with the community. And I know he was very attached to this project. Our division certainly supports this nomination. Utah Open Lands, which holds the conservation easement on the property, obviously supports it as they've proposed it. The Sugar House Community Council has also provided a letter of support, as has the family of Dr. Ty Harrison.
Thanks, Louis. I had the pleasure of knowing him a bit as well, and I think probably several of us did. And in my time before being a council person working on air quality with Utah Society for Environmental Education, I had the chance to get to know him that way. So council members, if there are there any questions for Louis? Otherwise, we're down to the decision-making part of whether or not we want to put this through a legislative process. I'm looking at the goals of the briefing that Brian has articulated in our staff report. And if we do want to go through a legislative process, do you want to hold a public hearing?
Madam Chair?
Yes, please.
If I may. I would suggest, I would ask, I don't think we need a motion, but I would like to go through the legislative process to rename this asset. And it looks like if we do that, we need to set this for a public hearing for the 22nd is what I see on our brief, on this sheet in front of me.
Are we required to have a public hearing?
No, I don't believe we are, but
option?
in the,
Okay.
I'm sorry,
No, go ahead. Sorry, Brian.
staff thought in the spirit of transparency that the council might want to do that, but I don't believe it's required.
In that case, Madam Chair, I think with the support that we've gotten from the Sugar House Community Council and the community members there, and knowing that it's in their district, I would ask that we go forward, then through the legislative process to rename this.
Without a public hearing?
Without a
Okay.
public hearing, correct.
Any other discussion? Thoughts on this one?
Second.
I think that, hang on, we're not making a motion.
Oh, I thought you did.
Well,
Sorry.
we can't take a vote in a work
Okay.
session, so, but I think if it isn't too much trouble for our staff to add a public hearing, maybe some of the community and the Westminster community might appreciate the chance to come out and say something about Dr. Harrison. Staff, would that be reasonable for us to ask to add? And it wouldn't slow down the process of adoption, would it?
No, the timeline we have proposed is for you to set the date tonight on the consent agenda for a public hearing on January 22nd, and then take action on February 5th.
Is that okay with you, Councilmember Fowler?
Yes.
Okay, then if there isn't any other discussion, then it sounds like we've got direction on going through the legislative process, holding public hearing that night. We'll set the date tonight. And the last remaining question, council members, is whether or not we want to ask the attorney's office to clarify some amendment to Chapter 3.65 of Salt Lake City Code about that ambiguity.
Yeah, Madam Chair, if I may again, I was looking at this and I think it would be helpful to clear that up, considering that, as Brian pointed out, we didn't have a council meeting within those 15 days. And I think just kind of given that time constraint, maybe we can clear that up a little bit.
I think also that I do like a legislative process for naming of major city assets and don't want there to be ambiguity about that. There's a really fabulous bridge over there in District 2 that needs a name that I've got my eyes on. So straw poll. Could we straw poll Amy's motion for clarification on 3.65? All right, I've got five thumbs up. Councilmember John, okay, I've got 6 thumbs up, and that's all of us.
Okay.
Actually, no one's absent.
Okay. We'll bring that
Anything
back
else
to
you
you.
need from us, Brian?
No, thank you very much.
Yes, and Louis, thank you for your work on this, and we'll be seeing you in just a second.
Well, thank you
Okay.
very much.
Thank you both. We're on to item A3, our demolition of dangerous or boarded buildings. We have Nick Tarbett from the council staff, our policy analyst, and Orion Goff, our building official for community and neighborhoods. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. Nick, hey, Orion, Happy New
Hello,
Year.
thanks for your time this afternoon.
The riveting subject.
Happy
here.
New Year.
Happy New Year to you, too. Nick, you want to start us?
If it's okay with you, we'll just let Orion get into this. This is an
Okay.
item that we put on. They were the administration was kind enough to be able to help us put this on quickly without any council staff review. We're here to help with questions, follow-up, anything that comes out of the briefing we can help with going forward.
Of course, to anybody in construction, demolition is an exciting thing, right? Over the years, we haven't really done much with the demolition ordinance since 2012. And over those years, some of the things that were implemented in 2012, we've gotten good feedback on from citizens, from council members, and from even city staff, and how it's affected their jobs. So we've spent about a year with the attorney's office and with Greg from my staff and Mike Reberg, my boss, discussing the changes. We also had several meetings with Councilmember Adams before she left, and some of the things that you see in the ordinance were things that she was pretty passionate about. And basically the main purpose I see from doing this rewrite is to provide an orderly process that also protects the interests of the multiple parties that might be involved. In a city such as ours, with houses now that are 80 to 100 years old and sometimes even older, if they're not maintained pretty scrupulously, then they fall into disrepair. And we end up in a situation where we have to take some kind of action on a lot of these houses. And that action often includes boarding if they're no longer habitable. And a lot of times that's distressing because then they're going to be taken out of the housing stock for the city. And that's important as well. And then also if they're not maintained, boarded properly, then you're going to have all kinds of other nuisance type issues. So the new ordinance gives us some tools and some clarity on at what point a building gets to the point where it needs to be boarded, secured, and also at what point that it most likely needs to be demolished.
Maureen, may I ask you a question? And
Sure.
maybe it's for Nick. So yesterday, the item in our Dropbox packet that I was reading and making notes on looks a lot different from what has been updated in our packets today.
What was provided to you was, it was an outline of today's presentation, so
Okay,
it's
Just a short outline.
that's the
short outline
beginning.
of what was in there.
So if I refer to the previous piece of that packet, it's still relevant.
It is, but it's much more involved. It's actually all the work that we went through in the last year with the attorney's office to be sure that we were moving forward legally. We've also made an attempt to be sure that we're in line with state statute as it regards nuisance buildings. And that's one of the big issues. I'm not sure how deep you want me to go. I don't want to read off my papers, and I didn't do a PowerPoint
Madam
presentation.
Chair, I have a question.
Is that all right with you, Orion, if we jump into
Absolutely.
questions?
Yeah,
Go
you should-
for it,
you should do
Councilmember
that.
Rogers.
All right, Mr. Goff, my question for you is help me understand how the HAB board what is their role in this?
The only real change to the HAB board is that the HAB board is going to hear and decide appeals from the new language in Title 48, 1848. And previously, that wasn't their main job. It was just to conduct whatever hearings we had on buildings that were, where people were appealing issues that made them substandard. Issues many times in legalization processes where we have illegal units added, they have serious life safety issues, and sometimes not so serious. And so that's been mainly what the HAB board has done in the past, but this is going to give them a little bit more responsibility.
Is that going to create more work for your department, or is it going to streamline the process, or how is that going to help or benefit?
I think it will streamline the process, yeah. And also, they have a good working knowledge of what's going on in that realm anyway, because monthly they go on field trips to these types of units and view them and then make judgments on how to move forward. So, absolutely.
Thank you.
Councilmember Wharton?
Just so I'm not quite familiar with can you tell me like specific problems that this ordinance fixes that the current ordinance doesn't fix?
Yeah, very good question. A couple of things that we've had a lot of issues with are slowing down the process for property owners to move forward with demolitions. The current ordinance requires you to have a permit for replacement use before you're allowed to do the demolition. And that discouraged a lot of people from moving forward. On commercial properties, you were allowed to post a bond for the amount it would cost to landscape the vacant lot if you didn't proceed with your project. And so we found ourselves in the position of tracking these bonds, and then at some point in time determining what landscaping was going to be required, and then possibly taking the bond and landscaping a vacant lot.
So, but my understanding is the policy reason for having a requirement that there be the new permit in place is so that we can discourage having vacant lots.
Yeah. Yeah, this discussion will almost always get to the real basic meat of this subject, which is, would you rather have a vacant lot or would you rather have a nuisance property in a neighborhood? And the previous council debated that strongly for a long time. I know from my discussions with the police department and the fire department that those two groups would definitely rather have a vacant lot. I know from my perspective and the impact that it has on staff, disproportionate impact, that we'd rather have a vacant lot than a nuisance property. This ordinance gives us more clarity on what a nuisance property is and keeps us in line with state law. So that's a policy decision that you all can discuss. Also note that historic properties are different, right?
Right.
They go through a separate process.
But this would apply equally to houses and commercial structures, right?
Yes. Yeah, it has language for both.
Yeah. Okay. And is that policy reason the only reason that policy debate, the only reason why we haven't implemented these changes already?
I don't think so. I think it's a little bit, I kind of liken it to the sign ordinances where, nobody really wants to open up that can of worms. It's similar on demolition. Unless there's a real compelling reason to open up that discussion, it hasn't really been opened up. But I can tell you from an impact point on city services, nuisance houses and dangerous houses and boarded buildings have a much huger impact on, a disproportionate impact on city staff than a vacant lot would, where the biggest thing we'd be dealing with usually would be a weed complaint, and we have a really smooth process to take care of that.
Cindy has a comment, but before I lose my question in that vein, that maybe you'll be touching on anyway, I wonder if you might worry at all that an adoption of what we have proposed before us might, as we deal with a housing crisis on the other hand,
Sure.
And with the mitigation of residential housing loss shift to a different chapter reference, I wonder if the creation or the elimination of a single nuisance property, let's say it's a house, getting it faster to a demolition track doesn't eliminate some potential for groups like nonprofits that we support today who do restorations and renovations to intervene where possible. Are we fast tracking demolitions?
You know, I really appreciate that question, but we haven't seen that. It seems like the houses that get to the point where they are a nuisance and they are attracting the wrong element and they are causing all these disproportionate issues, they're past the point where a reasonable person would do the rehab unless they're forced to do it by the Historic Landmarks Commission.
Cindy?
Just a little history, is that okay?
Sure.
There was a time in the city when the policy was absolutely tear them down, they're a nuisance. And that led to a lot of times neighbors would call and say, I want that house torn down. It was vacant, may not have been vacant for long, but they wanted it torn down. And so the city was balancing a lot of things. After quite a few houses were torn down, then there were people raising the concern of the impact on the housing stock, there being less housing available, and also people use the term creating a hole in the fabric of the neighborhood, and that's always stuck with me. So you're balancing all of those things, and at the same time you're balancing these situations where a group has a really good use planned, but they don't have it entirely planned out, so they can't meet the very high standard that's in this most recently passed ordinance a couple of years ago. They can't meet that really high standard, therefore it's creating all this friction and that type of a thing. So there's kind of a balance that the policymakers have to strike, and what you're proposing helps address those peculiar circumstances, like the car wash in Sugar House or the 7th East building that had a fire in it, or those sorts of things where you really need to remove the building.
Yeah, I think it gives us...
still leaves open these other questions.
I think it gives us a more orderly process across the board based upon the work that we've done in the proposal ordinance.
I had a question. Did anyone else have questions? I'm looking at page, I'm in the old packet of 3 of 77.
It's okay.
So it's under the amend section 18.64 demolition.
You got it?
And I'm looking at item 7, which is around creating a new committee that includes a city council member from that district and a chairperson of the neighborhood council. And I have about 18 questions about that committee, such as how does this committee convene? Can they deny? Under what grounds? How many per year are anticipated? Do they meet in person or individually? Which staff person provides the information? If there's follow-up information, do you have a staff person designated? Is this an existing position? And does that staff already currently support other community or committees? I'm looking at page 3 I don't know, it's page 3 of 77, and the pages aren't numbered in this packet. It's under amend, the bold of amend section 18.64 under 7.
Under 7, yeah.
Yeah, the second bullet point that says includes committee that will meet to review emergency demolition requests. So
Yeah.
council members love to be included,
All right.
but this is news
Sure.
to me. So can you tell us about the committee?
Yeah, the concept here is that we'll have a group of people with a cross-section of experience versus having one person, the building official or the fire marshal, making that decision. One of the things that's been very successful in removing houses that were way beyond repair and were true nuisances in the last couple of years is a committee that was formed by the mayor that included somebody from the police department, somebody from the fire department, Mike Reberg, and somebody on my staff, to actually visit the site and come up with an opinion on what was a nuisance and what wasn't a nuisance. So in proposing this, which is something that we haven't been doing, the concept is that we're going to have a broader group of people making that decision on what constitutes this emergency demolition.
So I think that this is a great idea, but it becomes very complicated when you create a new committee, and we've seen this, and you've seen it too, Orion, in other iterations. But I think there's questions like, what if do you need to have a quorum of the committee in order
Right.
to make a decision? What if the chairperson of the neighborhood council can't or doesn't want to participate in that kind of decision making? And have you checked in with all of the new members of the committee and et cetera? So I think there's a lot to flesh out.
Yeah, so the anchor of this is the HAB board. As you can see, I mean, that's our intent, is to have the HAB board be the anchor of that, and they're already doing similar work
So
now.
could you direct me under 1864 where there are more details about that committee and its powers and authority?
Hang on, it's Greg, do you want to come up? Greg was in those conversations with the attorney's office about that.
Thanks, Greg. And if you could answer that, one of the many questions I asked about whether or not that committee can deny and under what grounds.
Sorry, I was just looking it up on my computer while you
It's
were
okay.
talking. So this should be at the end portion of emergency demolitions in 64, if I'm correct. It might take me a second to get there.
If
so
you
hold
could
on.
give us a line number, that would be really helpful.
Line document.
So what I'm showing is that under 1864 140, we have the emergency demolition applicability,
I'm sorry, did you say line 1864?
18.64.140.
Oh, section.
Give us a line number.
Line
Let's see, I'm
1848.
sorry. I got my wrong glasses on. I
1848.
think I see 1848 right
Okay.
there. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
That Nick is better, and he's saying yes.
So if we go down to 1864 150 under immediate city demolition, if we go from A through to C, that references that at least 3 members of the HAB board would be invited to these emergency meetings to consider the immediate demolition. Now, what I've been looking for within A through E here is where we would have a city council member in there. And I might be mistaken, but I'm just not seeing it in there at this point.
Me neither.
But that is something that could be added if that was a policy decision on your account, so.
Greg, it looks like in B, you guys it's being proposed that the Historic Landmark Commission staff person and city council member be notified. Is that as I'm read?
Yeah, so I think if we read D, the director of the Housing and Neighborhood Development shall make reasonable efforts to notify
That's
the
very
recorded
different.
property owner. So this is just a notification portion of the language. It doesn't say anything about a committee.
So it seems like this is, the proposal we have at the beginning is different from the ordinance that we're being asked to adopt on this regard.
Yes, and I don't know if this is something that changed in the past year or not. We did go through a couple of reiterations, but it's something that could be added fairly easily, I would believe, if that's your decision.
Well, I want to back up to appreciate that we have this early opportunity to look at the work that you're doing, and we haven't had, obviously we aren't to the level that we have a council analyst
Sure.
staff report on it, so I don't want to
Okay.
be too critical because I know we're early and we appreciate being early in the
No
conversation.
problem. You send us anything that comes into your mind, and we'll hash through it. We'll work
Did
it
you have
out.
a comment, Cindy? Okay. Council members? Councilmember Wharton?
So, sorry, during my last question, you were explaining that if the structure's in a historic district, that they'd have to comply with the historic requirements, but what if it's a historic structure that's not in a historic district?
Yeah, it would, my understanding is, and we might want to look into that a little bit clearer, but if it's not actually in a historic overlay or a contributing structure that's identified. You know, for example, we have historic buildings downtown
Yeah,
that don't have to go through our Historic Landmarks Commission.
right.
So anything that appropriately goes to that commission would have to go that direction, and it wouldn't be able to go the direction that we're proposing here.
Okay, why eliminate the landscaping requirement altogether?
Well, landscaping is a good idea, and it's a nice thing to have, but it's a huge amount of work to capture the bond. If the customer doesn't proceed in good faith and do the landscaping, which is a good possibility, because a lot of times those ownership groups form and break up and form before an actual project takes place. But it puts us in the position of having to capture the bond, track the bond, and then if it doesn't get landscaped, become sort of a landscape contractor, and then also somebody to maintain the landscape. So you have to balance the amount of work that would take.
Sure, but isn't there some other way? It seems like if we're saying, well, it's hard to track through the bond system, what if there was the requirement there and then there was like a penalty if you didn't landscape it?
One of the problems that we've ended up since 2012 was the bonds that we were capturing were performance bonds and not cash bonds. And performance bonds are notoriously difficult for us to just capture and use those funds on that property. So I think we'd have to up the ante on the bond. They'd have to be cash bonds, and cash bonds are more expensive than performance bonds. So it's something that we would like guidance from you on, from a perspective of supervising that process already for the last 4 years. I can tell you it's a big effort.
Okay, and why eliminate the notice requirements?
Pardon?
It eliminates notice requirements as well.
Which line are you on for that one?
Number 4.
Number 4, yeah, eliminates notice requirements if there's a net loss of, there's a net loss of units caused by demolition.
I don't know. Let us look into that and get you a specific answer.
Okay.
I'm not sure why that's in there.
Okay, those are big concerns for me.
Okay,
Me too.
sounds good.
Anything else, council members? This is a can of worms a little bit, so we're grateful you're coming to the conversation early. And I remember before I was on the council, Charlie, maybe you were on the council,
He might be the last person that was on that
the
council.
sugar hole
But I think
reaction.
Cindy has probably the best memory of how much work it
Oh,
was.
no one questions that.
Madam Chair.
Please, Councilmember Luke.
To that point, I will say that, you know, in 2012, when the council did take this up, I had just been elected. Much of it was in response to the sugar hole. At the time, there was a lot of concern there, but there were other issues as well. In the subsequent years, that ordinance has created a number of problems. I think, you know, Orion has talked about it, his department's talked about it, we've all heard and seen issues, so I welcome this. I think this is, everything that I've read so far looks really good. I do have some questions that I'll be, you know, following as things continue, but, you know, I do appreciate you and the administration taking this on and trying to address this issue, because there were a lot of unintended consequences with the 2012 bill or ordinance, and hopefully we can avoid as many of those pitfalls as possible.
Yeah, we'll work closely with Nick on that. One of the things, kind of an interesting allegory or anecdote on this process was, we were thinking that we were going to close all the gaps, right? And one of the things that a couple of times the creative developers did was they actually applied for a permit for the most minor use that you can imagine on that property. paid the permit fees, got their demolition permit, and then never proceeded with the project. So they accomplished exactly what they were attempting to do by skirting the ordinance through that loophole.
Please.
I would just say, yeah, I know that happens, but that makes me want to have more restrictions instead of less, is my inclination. I mean, I'm happy to be proven wrong or convinced otherwise, but that's what I'm worried about.
Sure. Yeah, and whatever you decide, we'll be good soldiers in enforcing it.
And this is one of those issues, Cindy Cromer's in the audience, that we probably can't get perfectly right no matter what we do. And so there's a reactive sense of this that it may be every 5 or 6 years, we're going to see this again because we adjust it reacting to some component over here. I can imagine in District 5, several properties that if they don't have a landscaping requirement, we're going to have enforcement out there working on the 4-foot tall weeds and people sleeping in the weeds and having mattresses at the back of the property that we can't see because they don't have any landscaping and they aren't maintaining it. So it's kind of 6 one way, half a dozen the other.
Sure.
That might be the way this game is played. But anyway, again, we appreciate your coming to the table and having the conversation. And I'll look forward to maybe seeing some options that the council could consider on ways to engage council members. These are politically hot properties typically, and it would be wonderful to have an assurance that council members will, I think, better than being notified, be better than a reasonable effort to be notified, but to be able to attend those HAB tours or field trips if those happen. I'd love to see some consideration that we could talk about in a future meeting around that.
Sure.
Great. Anything else, council members? Thank you all for being with us. We'll keep the conversation going when you're ready to come back. Right now we're scheduled to take a break, council members. It was a tough 50 minutes. It was more like 40. Are you okay with a break? And then at 4:55, we're scheduled to come back for an update on the council district vacancy, followed by Inland Port and our draft Foothill Trail System plan. We'll see you then. Started on item 5, our update on the council district vacancy. And it's wonderful to see Nicole and Cindy in front of us instead of to our right. Thank you for being here.
Sure.
Tell us about the system that we have set up.
So we're like 3/4 of the way through the process. We've got another week to go, and it's obviously a hot item. We've got 11 applicants so far, and a week to go. So,
And those are listed on your website, is that right?
you know, they haven't been. We've been notifying all of you each time one comes in, but the question came up today as to why we don't have a list on there. And honestly, I hadn't thought about it until after the 15th, but we can put one up tonight.
Oh, that's great. Sorry, I didn't mean to start in the first 30 seconds with something for you to do, but it was an assumption I'd made.
That's great. We can do that. The process has been pretty easy. When the applicants come in, they really haven't had questions. They've just come in with their application and their resume or letters of interest, and we've verified their qualifications with the county, and we don't put them on the list until their qualifications are verified.
Do you have any questions for us? Is there any information you need from us?
Nope.
Questions, council members?
My only question, Madam Chair, when was the last time that the council went through this process? It's been a long time.
I don't know when the last time was. There's nothing in our current records, but when I was over at Archives, I found a big stack from like 1998.
Okay.
And I was
I mean,
scared
my
when
guess
I
is
saw
that's
it.
probably the last time.
Yeah,
Cindy
because it
remembers.
was really big.
Yeah.
I could tell you what we had for snacks, but I don't remember the year.
But the person, the council member,
People, yeah.
it was two
Oh, it was
at the
two.
same time.
Lee Martinez was selected for District 1, and Mary Mark was selected for District 3. They both ran for re-election and weren't elected.
Okay.
We're not.
I'm going to check the,
Okay.
All right.
that was good research.
Okay. Thank you.
Tag teaming. Any other questions for, please, Councilmember Johnston?
So when they come in, you have to verify their residency and age, et cetera, and they have an application and sometimes a resume. Is there anything else documentation-wise that we would receive from any of the applicants before we have to meet with them and all that, or?
No, I don't think so. I mean, some of them have submitted letters of interest. I think that whatever they bring, we pass on to you.
Okay. But there's not, I mean, this isn't a very frequent
No.
situation, so would we be able to set up anything else as far as materials we'd want from them before, say, the interview process, or how does that work?
You could do that as a group. You could decide what you would like to ask them for. One of the things that we will do is anything that has been received from them, we would put in a packet for the meeting at which they would be interviewed. And we do want to come back. We spoke with the current chair and vice chair. Soon we'll speak with the new chair and vice chair about the possibility of coming back to you next week with some different process options for how to go through and make a first cut, second cut, that kind of a thing. So, but if you guys wanted to now at this point say you'd like to receive XYZ material by the like 16th or something, then you'd be giving it isn't part of the announcement, but I'm sure people would do that.
But that would go through the recorder's office?
It isn't part of the application process. They've been very kind, though, to be the receivers of such any number of things, so they may be willing to do that. If not, we can certainly do it.
Okay, so it's not required to go through the recorder's office necessarily, but,
After the original application process, perhaps not,
okay.
but we're willing to help.
And they've been fabulous.
Thank you. Well, thank
Councilmember
you.
Wharton?
So I think I emailed you about this, but there's only, all candidates have submitted a resume and a letter except for one, right?
No, there's a handful that have only submitted an application.
Okay.
1, 2, 3, 4 have
Okay.
submitted just an application.
Okay. All right. And then has anybody tried to submit more or anything?
Yeah, today There's a letter of interest and like a personal history
Oh, okay.
and a resume, so
Oh,
quite a bit.
okay.
So, council members, next week's meeting, we will be presented by staff, I think at least two options of how we can vote when we have our first interview session, which will be, I think, in the formal meeting, or at least we can hold that time across the hall. Of course, that'll be public. And the way we narrow down the candidates to 2 or 3, we'll be needing to decide that next week, okay? So whether it's a ranked voting approach or it's just simple 2 selection, we'll be presented with that next week. The other thing is, please submit questions to staff so that we can start to it's kind of like when we do the priorities meetings, I feel like, and we brainstorm, we find that there's a couple of strong themes of priorities. I think the same will be true of the questions we want to ask. So even if you jot down not fully formed questions, or if they're general subjects, please start emailing, texting, writing those down for staff members so we can start getting some questions put together. And can I go so far as to say that it may make sense for us to ask more general questions of the broad population of applicants, and not be peppering every applicant with many questions, so that we can get a general sense of the applicants and be able to narrow that down. So there may be a second tier of questions that come in later rounds, or the final round. Councilmember Luke.
One thought on some of the, the more basic questions. One thought that I had is the possibility of sending those out prior to the meeting, letting them respond in writing. Is that kind of what's been discussed, or?
That is absolutely an option.
Yeah.
And I think, for me personally, I think part of it is that I want the conversation element, or I want to see them present too. So I think if there are questions that we want to ask in writing, or ask for responses in writing, but maybe there's a couple we want to reserve for.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't do everything in writing, but I think more of the basic questions that we'll probably have consistent answers to. Those are the ones that I'm thinking. But the vision, those kinds of idea, the bigger picture questions we'd want to reserve for in person.
Great. So we can whittle down that approach, I think, at next week's meeting when we get into some of the format more, but please start getting that information or your ideas to staff so they can bring it back to us. Cindy, please.
Margaret Plain, City Attorney, has been kind enough to check with other city attorneys whose cities have been through this recently, to get some ideas from them and options and kind of feedback. And so we have the benefit of that information, and also this is a suggestion that incoming Council Chair Luke suggested, is one that hadn't been raised before but could be easily put on that list, so we'll do that. So we may come back maybe with 4 options. So input on 2 different things, the questions that you would suggest, and also the process. So we'll come back with you to you with a bunch of process options, but feel free to suggest some in the next couple of days. That way we can include them on the list.
Thanks, Cindy. Nicole. We'll continue that conversation next week. We'll move on to item 6, our Inland Port Authority update. And Councilmember Rogers, you're in the hot. No, you could go in the hot seat too if you'd like to. It's up to you, honestly.
On the hot seat. I'm always on the hot seat when it deals with inland ports. So here we go. An update. I've got some bullet point items, and feel free to ask questions along the way, but wanted to just address some items that have been going on that have been completed with Inland Port. For example, the budget adopted that includes funding to hire an executive search firm, which has been done. For legal support, which has been done, forming a technical advisory committee, the hiring of the interim administrator, community engagement process, and the business plan. We have the business plan RFP out, and it closes early this month. And inside of that RFP, these are great things. The RFP calls out for economic and environmental studies, recommendations for organizational, operational structure and funding models, specific site evaluation and infrastructure needs, and a review of existing inland port plans and data. So all of those things are incorporating things that have already happened that we're looking for moving forward. So these are, in a world where we started in such a rough spot, I think that we've been able to accomplish stuff after the first couple of meetings that have smoothed it out and made it a little bit easier. We hired the executive search firm to find the full-time executive director, and that firm is called McDermott and Bull. They presented at the last November board meeting and outlined a 4-phase timeline for having an executive director in place. And that we expect to take about 90 to 120 days. So there's a weekly phone call that's made with staff, and they talk and find out how the process is going and where we're at. We have hired an interim administrator. His name is Chris Conaby. I invited him to be here this evening, but he apologized because it was short notice. I thought, it might be nice to have him come in because he is on top of it. I mean, the guy, he wants to be more transparent than I think we've ever imagined this being. So I'm extremely excited. He offered for me to give out cell phone for council members to feel free to call him whenever you'd like if you have questions about it. This individual will assist with the RFP processes, coordinate efforts in the technical advisory committee, and begin the public engagement efforts. We hired the legal support, which is Michael Best Strategies, Paul Morris, who is heading that up. He is the attorney. Technical Advisory Committee is envisioned in enabling legislation. The purpose of this group is to provide expertise to the board on areas such as transportation, economic impact, environmental issues, zoning and planning, and natural resources. These experts will be critical to be laying the foundation for the future and success of this project. So we have held 8 Inland Port Board meetings this year, each with public comment, which is important. And the board, most of the board went out with a tour of the Northwest Quadrant that was put together by Laura Fritz and her team with the economic development. So it was a well thought out tour, and there were great questions asked. I think it was eye-opening for a lot of board members who haven't experienced the full tour of being out there. So any questions? I want the council members here to know how appreciative I am for their support with me on the Inland Port, and more specifically with our staff. We wouldn't be where we are today had we not been able to be so, what's the word I'm looking for? So engaged. I mean, that's really what it is being engaged. So I want to thank you all for that.
Well, thank you, James. It's an incredible amount of work that I know you didn't contemplate when you re-ran for city council. And I know your district and the rest of the city is glad that we have a voice through you. Thanks for your time and your commitment there. Any other questions for James? 3 cheers? Just kidding. All right, we'll move on to item 7, our draft Salt Lake City Foothill Trail System Plan. One of the best draft plans I've seen in a long time. Come on up, Louis Kogan, Kristen Riker, and our own Allison Rowland. Hopefully we'll begin our discussion. It's a good looking plan too, actually. Yeah, yeah.
So, thank you, Madam Chair. I provided a number of questions because essentially we're very grateful for the Public Services Department and for Kristen and Louis to be available to do a presentation, a quick briefing on this plan at this early stage, because we weren't able to ask them until late last week, and so they were very, very gracious in coming. I provided some questions that came out of just my reading, and those should be either in your online packets or in your folders. But Louis has brought a presentation, which should be, yes, is up. And so the idea is to allow them to present for a while. I don't know if Louis would prefer questions during, after, never.
Anytime during the presentation would be just fine.
And so he's planned about a 20-minute presentation, and then questions whenever you like.
Thank you. And thank you, Louis and Kristen.
You bet. I'm going to start out here. We're here today to present the draft Foothill Trail Plan. Louis began work on this in 2016 with an RFP to hire a consultant. And we ended up hiring Alta Planning and Design. And we hired them for their expertise on planning and design, engineering, and implementation of trail systems. They also did the Salt Lake City bicycle and pedestrian plan that was adopted in December of 2015. So Louis and Alta Planning worked together with several of the different owning jurisdictions, including public lands, public utilities, the University of Utah, the U.S. Forest Service, and Salt Lake City Parks, Utah State Parks Department. In addition, they also worked with over 50 stakeholder groups to provide a very robust public outreach to the constituents in Salt Lake City, and they had over 5,000 comments from that process. I want to quickly just say Louis's leadership on this project and his philosophy regarding public access to the foothills, and balancing that with environmental sustainability in this plan. It's a tricky balance, but through his philosophy, I think that we have gained the support and respect from our landowner jurisdictions. And so I just want to throw out a kudos to him, because this plan really reflects that philosophy, and I think that's why so many of the public are so excited about it. Today is really just a draft, and we're asking for your input, your suggestions and comments, so that we might incorporate those and ultimately have a formal adoption of the Foothill Trail Master Plan. So with that, I'm turning it over to Louis. He will be doing most of the presentation tonight.
Thank you very much, Kristen. And thank you, council members. It's exciting to be in front of you talking about this plan. Before I jump in, I just want to acknowledge, I think that the Foothill open spaces above Salt Lake City are an incredible resource that we often don't fully appreciate. And I think one of the reasons that they haven't, that we haven't really fully appreciated them in the past is because ownership in the foothills is really a checkerboard of multiple jurisdictions. And when any individual entity would look at their ownership in the foothills, it didn't reflect what the public would see when they would look up there and see this massive, open space area, natural open grasslands immediately above the city, with direct proximity to neighborhoods and to Salt Lake City itself. And I think that it's one of the things that makes Salt Lake City such a unique and attractive place to live and work and play. So I've been very excited to work in the foothills since coming to Salt Lake. That being said, it was apparent from the moment that I moved to Salt Lake City that all was not perfectly well with the foothills and with the trail system. And among the things that Trails and Natural Lands wanted to address with this plan, the 1992 Open Space Plan specifically recommended the creation of a comprehensive trails plan for the foothills, and that was never implemented, and obviously much time has passed. And as I mentioned, there's a checkerboard of ownership, and that includes public lands, Salt Lake City Public Utilities and their watershed program, the Forest Service, Utah State Parks, the University of Utah, and several private landowners. And because of that, there really is a lack of coherent integrated management. And the Bonneville Shoreline Trail Committee came in, a number of years back and was able to work with all the different jurisdictions and complete the Bonneville Shoreline Trail, at least through this portion of the plan area. But beyond that, maintenance and management that really hasn't come together. And so each entity, if it's doing anything at all, it's happening in little uncoordinated bits and pieces. So we wanted to try to address that. aside from the BST and a couple of intentionally planned connector trails, most of the trails in the foothills are either social trails, by which I mean user paths that have just developed over time because people have been taking a particular route, or they follow, old Jeep roads. And most of those are fall line trails, by which I mean they go, they follow gravity and go straight up and down either gullies or ridge lines. And that's very concerning because as use inevitably expands in the foothills, continued use of those trail alignments is ultimately going to result in worsening erosion and some pretty large problems down the road. Proliferation of social trails has been a significant issue. I'll talk later about kind of the extent of the existing trail system, but there are over 60 miles of just user trails in the foothills that we feel like are unsustainable. They're too steep, they're actively eroding, and they're really unmaintainable. There's very limited trailhead access. Most of the trailheads are informal, and I would really only call them access points because there's public access, but almost no amenities to help people know this is where I should access the foothills. This is a place where I can park. This is where I can. There's a map with information. And speaking of maps, there's almost no signage anywhere in the foothill trail system currently. There are limited user experiences, by which I mean that I think that the current trail system or the current network of trails really lends itself to people who have a fair bit of experience, or quite fit, and don't mind working very hard to climb very steep trail alignments. You can find a couple of trails that are pretty gradual, but for the most part, it's sort of an exclusive trail network, and it's hard to find different experiences that different users, different ability levels might be interested in. And finally, just there's a lack of intentional trail system design. So getting from point A to point B is sometimes quite challenging and circuitous. There's a lot of user conflicts on trails. So for all these reasons, we felt like putting together a plan was very important. On this first page and throughout the plan, there's reference to the foothills natural area. That is not a that is a term that we coined for this plan to try to encourage all the different jurisdictions to think about this as a cohesive unit, but it otherwise doesn't really have any. It doesn't have relevance before this plan. Our project vision. The Foothills Natural Area will provide a variety of recreational trail experiences for all ages and abilities while managing the foothills' environmental resources for future generations. And from that vision, we came up with 5 goals for the trail system and for the trail system plan. And if you don't mind me taking 3 minutes, I think these are very important, so I'm gonna read through them. First of all, we envision a trail system that is environmentally sustainable, which means that trails avoid sensitive habitat, they minimize erosion and sedimentation and vegetation disturbance, they make efficient use of available natural lands. The wild and scenic nature of the foothill landscape is protected, fragile natural or cultural features are avoided, and trails direct users away from closed or protected watershed areas. We envisioned a trail system which is enjoyable, which means that trails cater to a variety of recreation types and also to a variety of desired experiences, including solitude, escape, and connection to the natural world, challenge and exercise, and fun and excitement. Trail layout and construction should be optimized to the intended user group of any individual trail segment, and trails are routed to take users to desirable areas and points of interest. We envisioned a trail system which was accessible, which means trails that are accessible to a broad audience of beginner to intermediate trail users, including families, seniors, disabled individuals. Trailheads should be sited and designed to make it easy for people to get on the trails and should be connected to alternative transportation routes. Wayfinding signage and supplemental trail information should make it easy for people to understand and navigate the trail system. We envisioned a trail system that was safe, which means, in this case, trail user collisions and conflicts should be mitigated and minimized through trail design and use regulations. Signage and natural barriers minimize incidences of lost or disoriented people and make it easier for emergency personnel to locate accident victims. Trails should be routed to discourage trespassing on private property. Crime prevention through environmental design or CPTED principles are incorporated in trailhead design to mitigate theft and vandalism to parked cars. And finally, a trail system that is low maintenance, meaning trails drain water naturally, follow contours instead of fall lines, and effectively encourage users to remain on trail, minimizing maintenance and reconstruction needs and costs. Thoughtful trail layout reduces the creation and use of informal trails and routes. Trails are cited to bring regular trail users through problem areas to reduce incidents of vandalism, graffiti, and illicit activity. Thank you for letting me read through those. I know it takes a while, but I feel like it gives context to everything else that we did with this plan. To kind of orient you to the plan area, this is one of the maps from the document that I thought was helpful. Everything that's colored in on this map is within the area that we looked at for the Foothill Trail System plan, and I've put red circles here around how we roughly subdivided it into plan areas. So on the upper left, we call that the north plan area, the central plan area, and then the south plan area down to the lower right. And I'll just take a minute to kind of describe those to you. So the north plan area runs basically from Victory Road and Ensign Peak north across Meridian Peak, which not many people know exists, and then all the way up to the Bonneville Shoreline Preserve and the North Salt Lake border. Most of the south side of that area is Salt Lake City ownership, a combination of public lands and public utilities property, and then the Forest Service has significant ownership along the northern edge. The central area is generally above the avenues, and that runs from City Creek on the west up over Morris Meadows to the avenue's Twin Peaks, and then up into the upper forks of Dry Creek. Salt Lake City is far and away the largest landowner in that area. Again, a combination of public utilities property and public lands property. The majority is actually public utilities lands. And the Forest Service is a minority owner in that neighborhood, and then also in the vicinity of Perry's Hollow and Federal Point, there are a number of significant private properties as well. And then right as you get towards the University of Utah, you enter University of Utah property. The south plan area runs from Dry Creek and then basically down above the University of Utah and Research Park campus, and includes the summits of Mount Vancott, Red Butte, and Mount Wire. That area starts in University of Utah property, their Heritage Preserve, which has a conservation easement on it held by Utah Open Lands, and then includes quite a bit of Forest Service land as it crosses Red Butte Canyon, and pretty much all of Mount Wire is Forest Service land. And then right at the mouth of Emigration Canyon, there's a bit of Salt Lake City Public Utilities property in our plan area, and also a significant chunk that is owned by Utah State Parks and managed as This Is the Place Heritage Park. We, as Kristen mentioned, we've been doing quite a bit of public engagement for this plan. We started way back in June of 2016. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. We started back in June of 2016. So June of 2016 to June of 2017, we did a year-long outreach survey where we were out. We had staff out on the trails, engaging people, telling them about our survey. We were out there with iPads, having people take the survey. We were posting trailheads, just trying to get as many trail users as possible to give us feedback about how they use the trail system and what their preferences and desires were. We got between 1,400 and 1,500 responses. That informed how we shaped the RFP for the Trails Plan. Once we had Alta Planning and Design on board, actually, I should also mention that we were able to insert several questions into the statistically valid survey that Y2 Analytics did for the Parks and Trails Natural Lands and Needs Assessment survey, and that was a citywide survey that was corrected in various ways for statistical significance. And so those answers to those questions were also very helpful. Once we had ALTA on board, we did a deep dive, which was a week-long intensive retreat to come up with a first draft trail system plan. We ended up with 37 different stakeholder groups joining us for that. And along with that, we also did a number of additional intercept surveys on the trail system, user counts at various trailheads. That resulted in the generation of a first draft of the plan around November of 2017. And then we created an online map and public input platform that we advertised very widely and shared with the public. And we were very pleased with how well that worked. We had about 2,300 participants in that, and we got a lot of really great detailed public input and information. People were able to draw preferred trail alignments on the map, highlight our identified trail alignments and tell us if they liked them or if they didn't and why, all sorts of things. Then after that, so we had that map open for about 2 months, and we started for a number of months. We did presentations to all sorts of relevant Salt Lake City citizen advisory boards, community councils, et cetera. And over that time, we were revising that first draft. We came out with the second draft of the plan in April of 2018, and we put a new version of the online map out there. We had about 800 responses to the second version. We also organized and widely publicized 2 open houses. We had about 300 participants to those, which we were very pleased with, and we advertised the open houses, among other ways, by making sure that we sent a direct mailing to every resident who lived within a half mile of the Foothill Trail system. We wanted to make sure that we were capturing neighbors as well as trail users. The data that we collected from that allowed us to come up with essentially a third draft that ALTA completed in August of 2018 and had incorporated about over 5,000 public comments in the development of that draft. Then starting in July, we entered into sort of internal review, and we had transportation division, planning division, public utilities, and our own folks review the plan. And that actually went through December and generated a tremendous amount of comments. So the document is still in revision as we respond to those. So this is a great time. We're still soliciting feedback, so we're obviously in front of you today. I'll be going to Planning Commission tomorrow. Later this month, we expect to be back in front of the Parks, Natural Lands, Urban Forestry, and Trail Board, and then also the Bicycle Advisory Committee. We expect to weigh in on this as well.
Louis, as you go through these city entity conversations, what is the way that the public can still engage? Is the website still active?
The website is still active. We are still getting emails from folks. And then we don't have the interactive web maps still active, but we continue to post the updated drafts of the trail plan. And then we are also planning, as we get to the eventual public hearing with the City Council, with Planning Commission, we will be sending out an email blast notifying everybody who's participated to date that we'll be doing that.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Luke?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sorry, we get
so-
one in, we just.
You what?
I
So
didn't
the question that I have, so once you move forward with this and have, all the comment and everything, what's the plan for everything between Emigration Canyon and Parlays? Because that, I know, is going to be another substantial section. I understand that there are more problems with that just because of private property issues and Forest Service issues, but are you developing this plan in a way that you could add on to it and that you're not going to have to redo the entire process?
That's a great question, and it was going to be the very last thing I mentioned, but I'll say it now. We are intending, probably in a couple of years, is the intention, to basically do an update to this plan to include the area that you're talking about. There's likely going to be property ownership transfer in the vicinities of Parlays Point, I know you're aware of, and that will provide a substantial amount of additional open space land that we have to work with, facilitate quite a bit more of a Bonneville Shoreline Trail connection, and I think make it worthwhile to go through that planning process.
Okay, so the plan on that is a couple of years out?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. I wanted to acknowledge that the draft of the trails plan that you received in your November 5th transmittal has sort of been, several parts of it have been updated as we've continued to work on addressing comments, and the most significant changes that have been made since the draft that was attached to the transmittal, we have modified several trail segments to accommodate feedback from the different landowner agency jurisdictions. Really, there weren't very many changes. The most significant one is that we've modified the trail system in the upper forks of Dry Creek and taken out the trail that was sort of in the far upper reaches of Dry Creek for environmental and habitat protection concerns. We've also made substantial revisions to the phasing plan based on feedback that we've received recently from the different landowner jurisdictions and based on how long we think it's going to take to work with the university versus the Forest Service, et cetera. And we've also taken a much closer look at our construction estimates and construction cost estimates and maintenance costs, and so we've substantially revised those as well. Our proposed trail network at this point, well, right now there are about 107 miles of existing trail if you take into account the Bonneville Shoreline Trail and its connectors through this, and then all of the other, I guess what I'll call social trails of any kind. Many of those are, very faint, but we tried to map all of them that we could. We are proposing to construct 65 miles of new trail and incorporate 41 miles of existing trails into a trail system that would then total virtually the same, about 106 miles of formally adopted trail system. And then we would then hope to gradually over time allow the remaining unsustainable user trails and social trails to either be actively or passively decommissioned or abandoned. Realistically, we fully anticipate there will be some that we can't get rid of and are very beloved, but I think that for the most part, once we have a fully functional trail system, people will really appreciate that, and some of the user trails quite a few of the user trails will go away. When it's all said and done, the formal trail system will have just over 18 miles of trails that would be managed for foot traffic only, and about 17 miles of trails that would be managed exclusively for downhill mountain bike travel, about 46 miles of trail that would be open to all users in multiple directions, and then about 26 miles of trails that would be open to all uphill traffic, but only foot traffic downhill. Yes?
I just have a
Councilmember
quick
Fowler,
question.
please.
Of these 16.62 miles of mountain bike trails, are any of them going to be easier than they are right now, that I can actually ride the trail?
Yes, absolutely. I think that the bobsled trail in the avenues is far and away the most difficult trail, and it will remain the most difficult trail. We're looking to try to create, more easy and intermediate options.
And my brother, who is a single track rider and spends as many nights a week up on these trails as he can, wanted me to emphasize that most of the competition runs have an average of 70% or greater grade, and that demand is definitely there for some riders who want steep and hard, and they don't want those trails decommissioned.
Yeah.
So I know there's a gamut of access and user abilities, but I think when it comes to the creation of those social trails, that's a really illustrative example of who the users are and there's steep ones for a reason, and anyway.
Thank
That's
you.
my plug for my brother.
We received a tremendous amount of feedback from every type of trail user, but definitely heard from plenty of people in what I would say the advanced to extreme mountain bike community. And I feel like we now have a very thorough appreciation of what trails they like to use and really don't want to go away. Some of those we feel like just could not be incorporated into the formal trail system because maintenance of them would be virtually impossible. They're so steep, but at the same time, eliminating them did not seem like a good idea because they have a diehard user base. And so there are trails for which we simply recommend. We're not planning to decommission them. We're also not planning to sign them. The people who do use them are few but committed, and they know
travel with shovels.
They travel with shovels. They know they're there. We do want to discourage the building of, I guess, what I'll call pirate trails. That can have a substantial detrimental effect on habitat, and so our hope is that as this trail system is implemented, there really will be something for everyone, and the need for that will be less. I think I'm hoping that all of you have had at least a brief chance to look at the maps that are in the plan. I just wanted to point out really quickly, this is the big overview map of the plan for the whole trail system. Solid lines represent existing trails that would be incorporated into the formal trail system network. Dotted lines are trails that are proposed to be constructed, and then the different colors represent management controls, whether they're multi-directional, biking, hiking, or a combination of those. We've really tried to do a thoughtful job connecting desired locations and points of interest, creating loop trails, making sure that we're building trails at sustainable grades, that we're creating opportunities for varied experiences, and that we are avoiding conflict. So if people really dislike running into mountain bikers, they have places where they can go. If they want to just rip down a trail on their mountain bike, they have places where they can go without fear of crashing into someone. And then I just, again, I suspect all of you have probably taken a look at these, but we created a bunch of tables with additional information about each trail segment, narratives about the trail, the type of use that we anticipate, its features, its recommended width. And then for some reason, as I was converting the PDF to a PowerPoint, the habitat study areas disappeared. So I just wanted to emphasize again that we are also recommending 3 habitat study areas, basically in the areas of the foothills which are furthest away from the current high levels of use. So currently pretty limited recreational impact. We want to make sure that we're doing some amount of due diligence there to study the potential impact of proposed trail construction, so that we're not ruining really sensitive open spaces by plowing a trail right through the middle of them. And so trails that do go through the habitat study areas, we're planning to delay construction of them for a couple of years until we have a chance to do a little more investigation. The plan beyond just the trail.
Louis, can we pause you for
Yes,
a moment,
absolutely.
Councilmember Luke?
So if you could go back to the map there. So I know that there are mountain bike trails, you're going to have walking trails. Do you have dog trails?
We intentionally decided not to identify leashed versus off-leash trail recommendations as part of this plan.
Because you wanted it to pass.
Because we wanted to be able to put a plan together, and we were very, very concerned that the whole planning process would just basically devolve. I think that when we have a plan, I mean, we've definitely been thinking about, I think there are plenty of opportunities in this plan to identify.
And I'm not saying that, I think they should be identified right now, but as long as you're thinking that, I've had that question asked a bunch, mostly from Chris's constituents, but.
And Chris has a question after you, so.
Thanks for
So-
queuing it up.
So, thank you.
Councilmember Wharton?
So, yeah, that's the main issue that I've heard about from constituents about these trails, is whether there would be, or why there weren't dog and not leash or on-leash designations. And I know that some of them, the trailheads have signs that say already that you can have a dog on a leash. But I also know that so many residents, especially the ones that live like abutting the trail, just let their dogs run up and all around. So I'm wondering, is there a way to create like a dog buffer if there is going to be, if people want to be off leash, that they can be, way up. But once it's getting closer to the city, if you're within a certain range of houses, would that be a potential solution rather than having to sign each trail?
I think there's lots of good solutions like that.
Okay.
And one of the things that we hope to do with this plan is really separate the dog issue from the trail issue. And making this a Foothill Trails master plan was kind of important to us to keep some of that out of it so that we could get a trails plan. And I think that that's something that maybe we should begin to look at, is how do we address dogs in the foothills? But separating that with this seemed like just a way to look just at the trail system and not specifically some of the rules that are surrounding the dogs in that area.
No, I understand that. And I guess I would just say that for so many of my residents, they're just not separable. And so, like, I want to hear from you as the experts as to what you think are the ways to start incorporating these into the conversation, because it's what I hear the most about. And then probably a close second to that is enforcement of bikes on walking trails or foot trails, and residents saying that there's like no enforcement, that the bikers go wherever they want to go and they knock people over or they chase their dogs away or whatever. So how are we going to enforce, who's going to be up there to enforce these things? Is it just going to be complaint based?
So we also heard loud and clear from a lot of people who were, it was interesting because when we did our needs assessment citywide survey and asked people about, how concerned were they about bike conflicts and dog conflicts, they weren't particularly, they weren't as concerned as we thought. But then once we started to identify specific trails that had management controls and said, this is going to be a hiking-only trail or a biking-only trail, suddenly people felt like, well, this is a great chance for me to talk about, those dang bikers or those clueless hikers. And so we feel like in enforcing the management controls here, we've tried to create a trail system that does, a really good job of allowing people to sort of, separate themselves onto a trail alignment that fits with their desired experience, and that those things are dispersed really effectively throughout the whole foothills. But we have recommended the creation of a foothills ranger as part of the management of this, and we were looking to Draper and Corner Canyon, and I think as they developed their trail system, they were seeing a lot of the same issues exploding as their trail system, sort of was created and then became popular, and they currently have a single foothills ranger position, but at least according to them, that even that single position has been extremely effective, and that part of the thought is that if there is at least the possibility that you could could potentially encounter, you know, an enforcement official who would be making sure that people are, you know, appropriately following the management designations of the trails, most people would probably comply with.
Yeah, and I think we might need 2.
And I think we need a park ranger pilot program too.
Yeah.
So that's a can of worms
They can
for
run
later
that, too.
this year.
But yeah, I think it makes sense to have somebody doing the basically District 3 and then the other one doing District 6 because of how massive it is. I don't need to tell you that. And then I have one other question. Oh, I'll wait till you get to the next slide, actually.
Absolutely.
But if we need to allocate more resources to enforcement stuff, I think that's something that I'll be keeping an eye on, so.
Thank
thanks.
you. Councilman, would you like me to talk about this slide, or would you like to jump in?
And I just want to say, we have time, but we also have a couple more agenda items in just a few minutes.
Absolutely. I will move quickly. So we also took into consideration access to the trail system as part of this plan. I just was showing here some of our specific some of our generalized recommendations for a major trailhead. We identified 5 major trailheads that should be improved or developed across the trail system, 10 minor trailheads, and then 19 access points. Basically, right now, the trail system is almost exclusively access points with a couple of informal trailheads. And so we're recommending that basically 15 different sites be improved in some way to be to function as either a minor trailhead with some amount of parking and a few amenities, or a major trailhead with more parking, more amenities. The major trailheads would be located on primary, on larger roads with more connectivity to alternative transportation networks, et cetera. The 5 major trailhead locations we're proposing is an existing trailhead at Tunnel Springs in North Salt Lake, Warm Springs Park, Bonneville Boulevard, the Salt Dome, Popperton Park, and Emigration Canyon Road.
Madam Chair, so a question on the Emigration Canyon Road. Is that the trailhead that's across from the zoo right now? Are you looking at expanding that trailhead, or is it further up?
It's the one, or rather 2 spots that are across from the zoo at the mouth of the canyon.
Okay. All right. And as far as parking goes, have you had discussions with this as the place to see if they would be amenable to allowing the use of that eastern parking lot? Because I know parking is very tough there right now because they have it barricaded off.
Yes. We have had conversations with them. They have not offered that parking lot. They have offered to allow us a pretty substantial use of the kind of the far eastern side of their property, including there's a large mothballed restroom there and a lot of space that they really don't use, but not the existing parking area.
Okay. Okay.
Member Wharton.
Thank you.
So Memory Grove Park is just really, really high risk for fire during the dry seasons. And I know I've been contacted by some residents on Northmont that are worried about using the Salt Dome and then having additional parking just there along the road and making sure that we have, if we're going to do paving there, to have curbs as well. I guess the curbs are not currently in the plan, but that's really essential, I think, to have that buffer, not just the area under the car, but like a whole. And if there's not a curb, people are just going to go as far as they can off of the paved road and create another situation like we had this summer, even though I don't think that was started by a car. But
we've heard from those residents as well. I think it's a very valid concern, and I think that we do want to make sure that there's some sort of a barrier, curb, concrete barrier, something like that. There's a wall along part of it now, but making sure that continues so that it's very clear that people either cannot park along the outside side of the road, inside side of the road, or either making it physically impossible or at least making sure that there's concrete barriers so you don't have cars parking on dry grass.
Yeah, I think curbs is definitely essential, so I wanted to make sure that was on your radar. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Detailed design, it was not included in this. We have a FY20 CIP request that will be working its way through the process to do the detailed design and cost estimation for what we see as some of the most critically important trailheads. So we kind of see that working its way through the process. We also, with the plan, looked at design guidelines for trail alignment, trail construction, decommissioning of trails, signage. I know we're short on time, so I'm just going to skip through that. So we have updated our maintenance costs for the trail system. What we feel like trail maintenance really needs to take into account annual maintenance of the physical trail, as well as weed control along the trail corridors, and then on top of that, management of the trail system. We'd mentioned the ranger position. These costs are substantially larger than the previous draft for two reasons. One, we hadn't previously estimated anything related to weed control, and we actually think that is going to be a pretty substantial and necessary ongoing cost. We have puncture vine now growing at a number of foothill trailheads. We have yellow star thistle and a number of really horrible plants that are starting to make incursions into the foothills, and where our crew has been working to tackle some of these infestations. It's been extremely time and resource intensive, and we don't anticipate that letting up, but I think that it's very important that we continue to address it. So we added costs there, and then also as we have been basing a lot of our annual physical maintenance costs on a rule of thumb which says that about 4% of the trail construction costs should be then dedicated to annual maintenance of the trail. As we were looking closely at estimated construction costs, we decided that we'd probably underestimated construction costs for most of our trails because they're on steeper slopes, just kind of the nature of the Wasatch Front here. Initially, we were looking at an average of about $5 a linear foot, and we thought that probably most of the trails would actually be closer to $8 a linear foot to construct. So we updated our trail construction costs and our trail maintenance costs accordingly, which brought us to an estimate of about $420,000 a year for maintenance of the total system, which includes existing trails and proposed new trails and management. Currently, a small amount of maintenance is happening from the Trails and Natural Lands Division, and a small amount of maintenance is happening up there with the Bonneville Shoreline Trail Committee, but it's pretty minimal. And assurance of adequate long-term maintenance was very important to all of the jurisdictional partners that we've been working with on this trail plan. We understand that that's a lot of money, and it becomes a lot of money as you look at that, at funding that every year. So we are aggressively exploring a couple of different models to try to offset the costs of that ongoing maintenance. Currently, we're looking at nonprofit partner models like Mountain Trails Foundation up in Park City, and there's quite a few cities in our region that have strong partnerships. Yes?
I didn't mean to interrupt you mid-sentence. Councilmember Fowler has a question.
Sure. So a model where the city essentially engages with a nonprofit partner who works to conduct the trail maintenance and to fund it, sometimes receiving a small amount of funding from the municipality, and then they go out and fundraise to bring in additional funds. Another model that we're looking at is creating a maintenance endowment with a community foundation or another organization to try to bring in a substantial amount of private funding up front to hit an endowment target, and then the endowment would spin off an interest payment annually that would that the community foundation or other partner would provide to the entity doing the trail maintenance.
Thank you. And Kristen, this might be more for you, but what do we spend on maintenance for existing trails in that area right now?
Know that?
So currently, it's part of what our District 6 maintenance crew tackles on top of Parlays Nature Park, Wasatch Hollow, Miller Park, Hidden Hollow, and a couple others. So we haven't separated it. It's pretty minimal. We basically go up there when there's a critical issue, usually a serious weed infestation and occasionally a urgent trail maintenance issue.
Can you try, I get the sense that we may need another opportunity
Of course.
to come back to this.
Of course.
So I don't mean to cut you short, but maybe wrap it up in the next 2 to 5 minutes.
I can do that.
And with an assurance that we will have more conversations on this as our staff helps us dig into it more.
Absolutely, and I know it's a lot of information. I will wrap it up.
It's a beautiful piece of work.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, so finally, I just wanted to share our revised phasing plan. Based on recent conversations we've had with our different agency partners, we revised the phasing plan, so now we have, previously we had 4 phases. We've reduced that to 3 phases. Phase 1, we're estimating about $620,000 to construct and just over 14 trail miles. Phase 2 is a very large phase, both in terms of miles and costs, and then phase 3 is kind of everything else. We based the phasing off of public support that had been indicated for specific trail segments, who owned the land and how complicated it was likely to be to work with that landowner, and the need for additional habitat data collection before we constructed a trail. Let's see. And then, so we have now a total trail system construction cost estimate of about $2.8 million. We have the approximately $400,000 that City Council, you allocated this October. We are intending to go and look for additional supplemental funding from 2 grant sources. We feel confident that relatively confident we can get that money and probably be moving forward with full implementation of phase 1 starting in early 2020. There are some other costs here, obviously the decommissioning costs, which would be relatively small, signage development, which would also be relatively small, and then trailhead costs, which we really need to estimate. It'll probably be fairly large costs associated with some of the trailheads. This last map just looks at the trails that would be included as part of the what's currently imagined as phase 1 are highlighted. Most of those are focused in the avenues, and they're trails that were identified by a lot of people as being very high priority. Finally, very quickly, what we anticipate as next steps as far as public process. I already mentioned Peanut Board, Planning Commission, Bicycle Advisory Committee. I'm sure coming back to you several times and hopefully ultimately getting to a public hearing and adoption by the City Council. And then I think, because I'm out of time, I'm not going to dive into the implementation next steps, but please feel free to read through those. We're just basically, that's how we're planning to take this forward into the future. We have lots of to-dos, but I think that it is very possible to be building phase 1 of trail in 2020.
Exciting. So, Mr. Chair, I think, see, he's not even there yet. Councilmember Luke, we'll bring this back, and I'd like to propose, as the staffs Allison's produced some questions for us, that the questions, I assume you've seen them also, help us start our discussion for next time.
Yep.
And that'll help us navigate some of the policy questions or budgeting questions that are in there.
Perfect.
Great work on this.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, with that, we're going to move on to our small cell installation for Crown Castle NG West LLC franchise agreement. And there's two of those back to back. Kara Luke from our staff will be joined by Dan Ripp, our real property manager for community neighborhoods, and Kimberly Chitris, our senior city attorney, who's in the audience and maybe is on hand if we need her. Welcome.
So just to get us oriented real quick, there are actually two separate things, a franchise agreement and a master license agreement. They're similar but separate.
Thank you.
The franchise agreement is similar to, you've seen them before with CenturyLink and Verizon, that governs like digging for fiber installation. The master license agreement is a new process established last year for small cell wireless installations. So we've seen one of these so far under the new process, and then this is the next one with Crown Castle, and I'll turn it over to Dan for any more specifics on that.
Great, thank you. This is actually a very standard franchise agreement that the city, we do this on a standard basis, and there's really nothing different about the terms of this franchise agreement that we've seen before. And with this being the second master license agreement, same terms as the one that was issued in the first. This will go on for 10 years with a 1 10-year extension on that.
And we expect to see many, many more of these, huh?
They're slowly starting to trickle in.
Okay. Council members, any questions on this one? Councilmember Rogers?
It said in our staff report that they'll have to have fiber run to these, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
So if they do run fiber, are they is it the same method as Google Fiber was, that they can light trench, or like we did on the Strip? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I don't believe that they're going to do it the same way that Google did. I think that theirs is just going to be standard trenching from what I understand so far.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? Councilmember Wharton?
Yeah, last time this was before us, I asked about digital inclusion, and like, isn't there a way that we can try to include that in these contracts? Like providing more equality access to wireless signals?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's a little bit difficult to mandate where that they're going to put these in the city, in the franchise or the master license agreement. And I think the difficulty comes in that most of the installations that these carriers provide are all market driven. So they'll just take a big map of the city and they'll show where the gaps are for coverage, and that's where they're gonna locate their attachments. And so having an agreement that mandates where they go is a little bit difficult to go, and that may be something that our attorneys could even address as well.
In our staff report, it mentioned an attachment that about an article that other cities are able to do that and leverage it. Are we not, are we constrained by state law, or is it just different circumstances? Are you familiar at all with that?
Yeah, not as much, and I'm happy to, I don't know the answer to that, and so I'm happy to research that and let you know if that helps.
Thank you.
You bet.
Any other questions? Okay. Do we need to move on to item 9, or did we check that off at the same time?
Unless you have questions specific to...
No.
Okay.
Thank you, Dan and Kira. We have delayed to a future meeting our board appointment, item 10 on there. And standing items, do we have any announcements, Cindy Gus Jensen?
We do, you're faster. Okay, National League of Cities Conference in Washington, D.C., March 10th through 13th. We're on a bit of a tight time frame, so if anyone is intending to go but hasn't yet let staff know, please do let us know ASAP. Then the next item is the Public Utilities Department is kind to work with us in allowing us to use their mailing service to piggyback and include council newsletters in their utility mailing. They give us 3 months each year, and those months this year are April, August, and December. And so what I need to do is check with each of you here tonight to see which month you would like. And if those of you in districts 2, 4, and 6 are running for reelection, then August would be very difficult to do the newsletter for you because of the
Cindy,
policy.
if you could put me down for December, that way there's no conflict, because it'll be after the election.
Okay.
I'd like April.
Okay, so we have, Aaron is April, Charlie is December.
I'll take April too then.
Mm-hmm.
Time when we can just send a letter, or can we send other things too?
It's a sort of mini newsletter, so it can be like 4 pages, this size. So 8.5 by 11, 4-page little mini newsletter.
Can they put like a magnet in there?
Oh, no. No,
Too
but
heavy.
you can choose to use your communication money for something like that.
Okay. Well, I was in April last time, so I'm happy to be August or December, whichever is easier.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
I just did December, so. Strange to have another one come out.
Okay.
So I can do August for,
Okay.
do a mid-year.
Okay.
We're gonna need either April or December for 4, so do you have slots available?
Yes, there are slots in both cases.
They should do December so that they can get, I'm gonna pick 4D4. December so they can.
Tough.
Yeah, we should assume they're going to run.
Put D4 on, so they can get through an election cycle.
Or maybe April, whoever is appointed, they can talk about, who they are.
Production,
Yeah, welcome to,
Yeah, that's actually good.
you may wanna look at April.
Yeah, put them down for April.
here we are deciding for District 4. But anyway, any of those that works for me, so whichever's
Okay.
easiest.
I'm gonna submit it as one of my questions. How do you feel about being the April newsletter?
I'd like to speak for
Next
District
item.
4.
Next item.
Keep going, Cindy. Just plow through.
Okay. The
doesn't help.
financial disclosure forms, I know some of you have already completed those. So if you need any assistance, the attorney's office can help, or staff may be able to help a little bit.
But if nothing's changed and we don't need to make any adjustments, then we don't need a new one, right? Okay,
Margaret
great.
is saying that is correct. Okay. Then your seating lottery for this room will be ready to get that going at the beginning of your next meeting. So you pull a number out of a hat. Number 1 tells which seat that they want. The chair and vice chair are typically in these 2 seats. I suppose the chair and vice chair could choose to sit elsewhere if they wanted.
That's what I was thinking too.
Okay, and then the Citizen Compensation Advisory Committee, we need some feedback on whether you'd like to have small group meetings with the applicants. It would be best if we could get someone identified and approved soon, like in the next couple of weeks, because now is the time of year when the Citizen Compensation Advisory Committee is doing its work. So it's had, I believe their first meeting is coming right up. And then tomorrow morning at 7:30 a.m. at Tracy Aviary is the legislative breakfast. That's it.
I have a question, Cindy, not for an answer right now, but I remember that there are a few conference options in the spring. Some of, maybe there's 3 of them even in March between the Downtown Alliance, APA, and NLC. Could we ask that maybe next week we have a calendar kind of view of
Yes. Yes.
those that we know about?
Yes. Yes. In fact, we may have it on the
Council calendar
list
list.
here, but it is not very convenient.
And
Downtown Alliance hasn't picked dates yet, right?
the last we heard, they hadn't picked, the last I've seen, they hadn't picked dates, but that was a few weeks ago.
So we'll
Perhaps we
follow.
can reach out.
Cindy Lou, okay. Cindy Lou's going to follow up on that for us.
Thank you, Cindy Lou. Anything else, council members? Okay, we don't have a closed session, so we'll be across the hall at 7 o'clock. Thanks.